Chapter 36, we're taking a look at the post-World War II era, beginning of the Cold War, and also some stuff that was going on here at home from 1945 to 1952. Now, to start with, the end of World War II renewed some fears that many people had that the Depression was going to start right back up again, that the only reason that we'd stop the Depression was because of the war. Without the war effort, what's going to keep us from continuing on with this Depression? And in fact, we did see a slight decline in our GNP, our gross national product, from 46 to 47, but that's going to be a blip on the radar. In fact, we're going to see major economic growth during the end of the 40s into the 1950s, more so than ever before in American history. If you look at the last point on this slide, in fact, over the next 20 years, our gross national product actually continued to go up and up and up. Our income levels doubled over this time. So the fear of a depression was very, very short-lived. And in fact, the 1950s were going to be very economically prosperous. Some other things that we see in the 1940s and into the 1950s is a very anti-union sentiment, started with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. Conservative Republicans are really in control in about 1947 in Congress, and as retribution towards the Democrats for all their years of control, think of the 4 terms that FDR was elected to. They passed this act. Basically, it said that unions can't have, quote, closed shops, meaning requiring union membership. Also, that if there are any damages done during a strike, the union leaders are in charge of that, and all union leaders had to take a non-communist oath. Remember, communism and labor unions are sometimes linked because it is attacking business, so to speak. We also see, when it comes to the economy, the selling off of our war factories, starting to convert to some degree back to a peacetime economy. Not completely, and we'll talk about that later. We also see the government create the Council of Economic Advisors to make recommendations to the president on how to ensure that the economy stays up and running the way it should, so that we don't dip back into a depression like we saw before. But the single greatest thing that helped our economy from going back into the toilet was the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill of Rights. It was passed in 1944, but it is aimed at these returning GIs. The GIs were the soldiers during World War II. To cushion the blow, there are 15 million servicemen coming home from the war. What jobs are going to be available for them coming back into the United States? And this was part of that fear of that depression continuing on. So the GI Bill of Rights, in an attempt to cushion that blow, said to these returning soldiers they had the option to go to college on the government's dime, or a vocational school. And 2 million men actually took this opportunity, to the tune of about $14.5 billion. But the reason this is important is because it opened up a whole new set of opportunities for these men. Many of these men coming from the lower classes, the working class, it would have never been an opportunity for them to go to college. This gives them that option to achieve the, quote, American dream. Because always with more education comes the ability to have a higher paid job. So many of these men went on to work in white collar jobs. These are non-manual labor jobs, which helps to account for why our income levels actually doubled during this time. We also see the Veterans Affairs issuing very low interest loans for homes, farms, businesses, to allow that American dream to occur for our servicemen returning home. Okay, here you see this ideal America. You know, part of it is going to be not only coming home and going to college, but getting married, having the perfect family and the perfect yard out in the suburbs, which we'll talk about here in a second. So with the growth of this new middle class, remember, like I said, more education means a higher income for many of these returning GIs. They have money in their pockets now, like more so than they've ever had before in the history of the United States. They're looking to spend their money. They've already gone without, from the Depression to saving during the war. So very quickly in the late 40s, early 50s is going to renew that idea, that culture of consumerism that we talked about during the 1920s, where we just want to buy stuff here in America. That the American dream now is to own your own home, to have 2 cars in the garage, to have a pool in your backyard, to take a vacation, to own all of those creature comforts like a television, a washing machine. things like that. We want to buy stuff. And one of the things that's helping to fuel this culture of consumerism is not only advertising, like we've seen before, that idea of keeping up with the Joneses, constantly pushing Americans to buy, but this idea of planned obsolescence. That none of this stuff was made in order to last for forever. That eventually these things were going to wear out and break down, and you'd have to go out and buy the newest thing. So even if advertising wasn't pushing you to buy the newest car to keep up with your neighbor, the fact that it wasn't going to run forever, it was planned for it to eventually break down, is going to help continue pushing this culture of consumerism. One other major difference between the 1920s and the 1950s, even though there's a lot of correlations here, whereas in the 1920s we were buying, a lot of the stuff we were buying was, number one, on credit, which is still true in the 1950s. The difference here is that they could afford it more. But number two, that what they're really buying are homes. 1920s home ownership was only at about 40% of Americans. Compare that to 1960, 60% of Americans owned a home. So sure, we're buying stuff, but buying a home is one of those investments up until recently that can withstand the test of time. So that helps us to ride out any further economic crises in the future, that a home is a good investment, allegedly. Other major changes. Remember, during the 1940s, during that World War II era, women were expected to go out and work in the workforce. That Rosie the Riveter was a piece of propaganda, really pushed on women to do her part. However, with the end of the war comes an end to that propaganda. Now there is almost this expectation of women to give up those jobs, to go home and to be the traditional role of wife and mother, putting motherhood back on that pedestal, or as we've talked about before, that cult of domesticity is back on a pedestal here. But at the same time that society is pushing this idea of the perfect wife and mother, and we see this in television shows of the day and advertisements of the day, the fact is that still remains is that there are a lot of jobs open to women during this time. And not only open to women, but we almost need women to work, to do those traditional pink-collar jobs. These are women's work type jobs like secretaries and other office-related jobs. So there really is this dichotomy in American society between the need for women to work, yet at the same time telling women don't work, go home and to be that traditional role of wife and mother. This pulling back and forth is going to lead us later on to the start of the feminist movement. We'll talk about that later as well. And also, economically speaking, the U.S. is in a pretty good place. Even though we had played a major role in the war, we are not destroyed like the rest of Europe is. So it's not that difficult for Americans to get back to a peacetime economy. There's going to be a whole lot of rebuilding that's necessary in Europe before that can actually happen. So another reason why we actually didn't, go back into a Great Depression, aside from the fact that we had saved money during the war, we were buying all of these new consumer products. Another major reason that the Great Depression did not return is that as much as we were breaking down our military spending, the fact that the Cold War is about to start very soon after World War II is over, this division between the United States and democracy versus the Soviet Union and communism, which we're going to talk about, is going to lead almost to a permanent war economy, that we were on constant alert for a coming war with the Soviet Union. So this is going to lead to massive defense spending, and the fact that even up until today, the United States government is spending a ton of money every single year on defensive spending, building up the newest military arsenal or the highest tech defense, using scientific research to bolster aerospace travel, electronics, plastic. All of this is being funded with defense money. And we talk about the national debt that the United States has today, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But the major reason that we have such a high national debt is right here. The Cold War spending on our military defense is a large reason why our national debt is so high today. But at the same time, it helps to keep that depression from coming back because there are jobs available in these wartime economies. Now, Other areas to focus on. U.S. business is doing great, especially when it comes to oil production. It's cheap. It's readily available. The United States pretty much controls large portions of the oil flow in the Middle East. And so why not own these gas-guzzling cars like we think of when we think of the 1950s? We have a very independent spirit here in America. Also, we're very spread out. A mass transportation system like we see in Europe today is not going to be as easily achieved here in the United States. And so in 1956, under President Eisenhower, he signed the Interstate Highway Act. And this is what creates the interstate highway system that we see today. All of us are owning cars. We have a desire to move out to the suburbs. Society is changing. And now we have highways that enable us to get from one side of the country to the other in a matter of days as opposed to weeks previous to this. So the standard of living is going up. People have money in their pockets. They are spending that money. We are investing in a good business or a good investment like home ownership. And so life, economically speaking, during the 1950s is pretty darn good compared to past generations. One other major change to the economy in the 1940s and 1950s is the creation of agribusiness. Agribusiness is a movement away from that traditional family farm like we've always thought of, Jefferson's main idea of what America should be, now to big business owning all of our major farms in the United States, using new technology, using scientific research to really produce more of a yield in a smaller amount of area that can feed the entire world essentially. We don't need as many farmers today to still produce as much food as we are producing. And this is all because farms are now being run more like a business rather than a small family farm. Okay, here you see some of those advertisements, like I said. Here's one for Coca-Cola, very prevalent during the 1950s. Here is an ad, obviously, for two Fords, that this is now the American dream. And here you see that perfect quintessential American family living out in the suburbs with their 2 cars and kids. Here is that agribusiness. Like I said, we don't need as many farmers today to do the job that all those family farmers had done previously. Okay, so other major changes. The 1950s is really all about change in American society when it comes to economy, family structure, etc. This new economy means that there are jobs all over the country now available for people. People are not staying where their extended family lives. We are moving all over the United States looking for jobs where they can find them. The population redistribution in the post-war years is staggering. 30 million people moved every single year after 1945. That's huge compared to past generations. But this does create a change in the family. Previously, people would get married, they'd have kids, and we would rely on the elders within our family for their experience when it comes to child rearing. We are now more isolated from our extended family, and so people start looking to psychologists and other child experts to tell us how to raise our kids. The most popular of whom was named Dr. Benjamin Spock. He wrote a book that sold millions upon millions upon millions of copies. The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. This is research-based advice on how to raise our child, which is still very prevalent today. Another major change is the growth of what is known as the Sun Belt. This is very important. The Sun Belt are the southern states into the southwest, California, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, those types of states. The population redistribution towards the Sun Belt states is staggering. In fact, the population in these states grew 2 times that of the northern, quote, Rust Belt states like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. Number one, there's a lot of money being invested by the federal government in the Sun Belt states in the defense economy, aerospace technology, etc. Number two, air conditioning is now more readily available, so people don't have a problem living in these very humid and hot climates because there are jobs available and air conditioning is now available. Other changes population-wise in the United States at this time is the growth of suburbs in the post-war world. Several things are making this possible. Number one, home loans are extremely cheap and readily available from the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and also the VA, the Veterans Affairs Bureau for those returning soldiers. Also add to that, the new highway system that is being built allows people to move out to the suburbs right around the cities and still have the ability to commute back into the city for their jobs. And so men come home from the war, they get married, they start having children. We want to live that American dream in the 1950s, out in the suburbs where kids can run around in a lawn. And so we start building these suburbs like never before, mass producing these suburbs. The first mass-produced suburban housing development was developed in 1947, Levittown, which is on Long Island in New York, developed by two brothers, William and Alfred Levitt. This was the first planned community. Now, we've had suburbs before, but the reality was that before, if you wanted to live in a house, you would go to an architect, he would draw you up some plans, you would build a house, and it would take several months. We don't have time for that. There is such a demand for new housing, especially in the suburbs, that we don't have time to wait for plans to be drawn. And so the Levitt brothers, using a strategy that has been very popular since 1793 of mass production, using standardized parts, begins building houses in a very quick way, having standard plans where every single house looks exactly the same down the road, that they were able to build these houses in a matter of 2 weeks, 3 weeks compared to the months that it used to take in order to meet the demand. So millions of Americans began moving out to the suburbs as a result. Here you see some of that population redistribution. Take a look at the growth of some of those southern Sunbelt states. Here you see the movement to the suburbs, how prevalent it was. Now, another side effect of this movement to the suburbs, is known as white flight. Aside from wanting that American dream to live in a nice suburban area with a lawn and have your kids go to nice schools and whatnot, was this idea of white flight, the idea of whites wanting to escape the African Americans living in the cities. Obviously, this is racism. That moving to the suburbs allowed them to create these all-white communities for several reasons. Number one, racial segregation in a lot of parts of the country disallowed loans to African Americans. Number two, there was no law denying somebody from selling a house to a black person, that you could say, I don't want to sell to you because you are black. And so as a result, many of these opportunities are denied to the African Americans, forcing them to stay in the central city as the white people move out. This creates what's known as the donut effect. If you think of a donut, it's got a very rich outer ring and the center is hollow. So as these white people begin moving to the suburbs, they take with them their tax base, they take with them all of their money, and they start building schools, and they start building shopping centers, and they take all of their money out to these suburbs and leave a gaping hole in the center because there isn't the money that was once available in the cities. And so this is going to add to not only the racial prejudice aimed at African Americans, which we'll talk about more as we get into civil rights, but also the economic discrimination aimed at African Americans as well, because they don't have the capabilities of getting these higher paid jobs because of discrimination at this time. Part of this desire to move to the suburbs is fueled by the baby boom. This is crazy, crazy important. For the 1.5 decades after World War II, from about 1945 to about 1960, GIs came home and they started making babies. It was an explosion in America's birth rate after World War II. 50 million babies were born by the end of the 1950s. This is crazy compared to past generations. But with the baby boomers, as they're called, they've created structural problems for us at every stage of their development. You know, when they were born, it required more hospitals for these kids to be born at. When they went to school, more schools had to be built. Now, as more baby boomers are starting to retire every single year, this is creating a whole lot of problems for our Social Security today. So even though this is something from the 1950s, it is affecting us a whole lot today because the baby boomers are going to bankrupt Social Security unless the government can do something to stop it.